Miss Marple and the Murder Among the Marrows. Welcome to Velvet Clues. I'm your host Connor, and tonight we find ourselves in the peaceful gardens of St. Mary Mead, where rows of vegetables hide secrets far darker than the rich soil beneath them. Before we begin this investigation into Murder Among the Marrows, I'd love to know where in the world you're joining us from this evening. Drop a comment below and let me know your location. Now, settle in with something warm to drink and let us walk through Miss Marple's garden as she uncovers a most terrible crime. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Morning Discovery Among the Marrows. The August sun rose over St. Mary Mead with that particular golden quality that promises a perfect day for gardening. Miss Jane Marple had woken at her customary 6 o'clock, performed her morning ablutions with brisk efficiency, and by 7:15 was making her way along the gravel path toward the Allotment Association grounds. Her wicker basket contained her secateurs, a hand trowel, and a small notebook where she recorded the progress of her herb garden with meticulous attention. The allotment grounds sprawled across 3 acres on the eastern edge of the village, a patchwork of 60 individual plots where St. Mary Mead's residents cultivated everything from prize-winning vegetables to modest collections of cutting flowers. Miss Marple's own plot, number 47, was a tidy rectangle devoted primarily to culinary and medicinal herbs. She had held it for 12 years, and the Women's Institute regularly benefited from her harvests. As she approached the main gate, Miss Marple noticed something unusual. 2 police vehicles were parked along the lane, and a small crowd of fellow gardeners had gathered near the entrance, their voices carrying that particular tone of shocked speculation that accompanies unexpected tragedy. Miss Marple quickened her pace slightly, though her expression remained composed. In her experience, rushing toward disaster rarely improved outcomes. Constable Polk stood at the gate, his notebook out and his young face grave with official duty. Miss Marple recognized several familiar figures in the gathering crowd. Mrs. Henderson clutched her gardening gloves and looked genuinely distressed. Thomas Wright stood slightly apart, his weathered face unreadable. Dorothy Price was speaking rapidly to anyone who would listen. Bernard Foster had his arms crossed, his expression suggesting more irritation than concern, and Sarah Mitchell sat on the bench near the water pump, her face very pale. "I'm afraid the allotments are closed this morning, Miss Marple," Constable Polk said respectfully. "There's been an incident. A serious one, I'm afraid." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and regarded the young constable with mild blue eyes. "How very distressing. Nothing that affects the entire association, I hope." Before Polk could respond, Mrs. Henderson burst out, "It's Mr. Finch, Harold Finch. He's dead. Found him in his plot not half an hour ago, just lying there among his marrows." The crowd erupted into renewed speculation, and Miss Marple noted how each person's reaction revealed something of their relationship with the deceased association president. Mrs. Henderson seemed genuinely shocked. Wright's expression remained carefully neutral. Price appeared almost excited by the drama. Foster looked calculating, and Mitchell simply stared at the ground, her hands twisted together. Inspector Slack's arrival interrupted the gathering tension. He emerged from Finch's plot with Dr. Haydock, both men's expressions grim. "Right then," Slack announced brusquely. "This is now officially a murder investigation. Harold Finch was poisoned with monkshood, also known as aconite. I'll need statements from everyone who had access to these grounds in the past 24 hours. The crowd stirred uneasily. Miss Marple suspected that if Inspector Slack wanted to catalogue conflicts involving Harold Finch, he would need considerably more time than a single morning's interviews would provide. Chapter 2. The Tyrant's Many Enemies. The temporary interview station Inspector Slack established in the Allotment Association's modest wooden shed quickly became the centre of intense activity. Miss Marple, having provided her own brief statement, positioned herself on the bench near the water pump, where she could observe the comings and goings of her fellow gardeners as they each took their turn speaking with the inspector. Mrs. Henderson was first to be interviewed, and she emerged after 20 minutes looking distressed but composed. She made her way directly to where Miss Marple sat and settled beside her with a heavy sigh. "Such terrible questions he asks," Mrs. Henderson said, "all about conflicts with Harold and who might have wanted him dead. Though I must say, Miss Marple, Harold did make life difficult for many people. Not that he deserved to die for it naturally." Miss Marple made an encouraging sound, and Mrs. Henderson continued. You know, he expelled me from my original plot. Plot number 8. I'd held it for 6 years. Harold claimed my maintenance wasn't adequate, that weeds had spread from my section to neighbouring plots. It wasn't true, but Harold had decided he wanted that section for his own use, so he found an excuse to remove me and reassign me to plot 43. How very unfortunate, Miss Marple murmured. Plot 43 is considerably smaller, is it not? Half the size, Mrs. Henderson confirmed bitterly, and poorer soil besides. Harold knew exactly what he was doing. He systematically removed anyone whose plots he wanted for his own purposes. Thomas Wright was nearly expelled last year on some nonsense about compost regulations. Dorothy Price lost her excellent south-facing plot because Harold claimed her flower cultivation wasn't sufficiently serious. The man was insufferable. Thomas Wright was called for his interview next, and Miss Marple noted how he walked into the shed with squared shoulders and a determined expression. His interview lasted considerably longer, nearly 40 minutes, and when he emerged, his face was set in hard lines that suggested the questions had not been gentle. Wright did not join the group of waiting gardeners, but instead walked directly to the far end of the allotment grounds, where he stood staring out across the plots with his hands thrust deep in his pockets. Miss Marple observed this behaviour with interest. Wright was clearly a man under considerable strain. Dorothy Price proved more than willing to share her experiences when her turn came. She settled on the bench beside Miss Marple with the air of someone who had been waiting for precisely such an audience. That man was a thief, Price declared without preamble. I've been keeping records of the association's finances for 3 years now, ever since I noticed discrepancies in the annual reports. Harold claimed we needed to raise fees because maintenance costs were increasing, but I've checked with every supplier he supposedly used. The numbers don't match, Miss Marple, not even close. Harold Finch was embezzling association funds probably for years. I'd estimate at least £15,000 missing, possibly more. This was indeed significant information. Embezzlement provided a powerful motive for murder, though whether it motivated Finch's victim or his potential accuser remained an open question. Bernard Foster's interview was brief, and he emerged looking annoyed but not particularly concerned. Inspector Slack seems to think I might have poisoned Harold over a vegetable competition, Foster said with a dismissive laugh, as if I'd commit murder over Marrows. Sarah Mitchell was the final person interviewed, and she approached the shed with obvious reluctance. Her interview lasted over an hour, and when she finally emerged, her eyes were red-rimmed. She walked quickly past the gathered gardeners and left the allotment grounds entirely. Mrs. Henderson leaned closer to Miss Marple. Sarah's husband died last year. Their allotment plot was something they had worked on together for 15 years. After George died, Sarah requested a transfer to a different plot, said being in their old space without him was too painful. Harold refused, claimed plot transfers weren't permitted except in cases of demonstrable need. Miss Marple felt familiar sadness. She understood how a beloved garden could become unbearable when the person who'd shared it was gone. Chapter 3. The Poisoned Hook and Vandalized Vegetables. After the interviews concluded, Miss Marple made her way toward where Thomas Wright still stood alone at the allotment boundary. The man had not moved in over an hour, and his isolated vigil suggested someone grappling with thoughts too heavy to share in company. "Mr. Wright," Miss Marple said gently as she approached, "I hope I'm not intruding on private reflection." Wright turned to her with a tired smile. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Just thinking about how quickly things change. Yesterday, Harold Finch was running this association like his personal kingdom. Today, he's dead, and we're all suspects." "You've held your plot for many years, I believe," Miss Marple observed. 23 years, Wright confirmed. "My wife Margaret started it when we first moved to St. Mary Mead. She had such a gift for growing things. Everything she touched seemed to flourish. After she died 2 years ago, keeping up her garden was my way of staying connected to her memory. Harold nearly took that away from me last year, threatened expulsion over some nonsense about compost regulations." As they spoke, Miss Marple's observant eyes noted something interesting about Wright's appearance. The knees of his gardening trousers showed recent mud stains, and the mud appeared to be a particular reddish clay colour that was distinctly different from the sandy loam soil in his own plot. The clay-red mud was, however, very similar to the soil composition in Harold Finch's plot. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, But Miss Marple had learned long ago that small details often revealed the largest truths. Inspector Slack's voice called out across the grounds. "Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock would like a word." She found the doctor examining Finch's garden shed with Constable Polk. Inside, the shed was immaculately organised, with tools hung precisely on marked hooks and supplies arranged with military precision. "We've found something rather significant," Haydock said, gesturing toward a brass hook on the wall. "This hook is where Finch hung his empty thermos before filling it each Sunday morning. It has traces of residue that I believe is aconite compound." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "So the poison wasn't in the tea initially, it was on the hook. When Finch hung his thermos there, the poison transferred to the thermos itself, and when he filled it with hot tea, the poison dissolved throughout the liquid." "Ingenious," Dr. Haydock observed. "The poison could have been placed on the hook at any time in the days before the murder. It would simply sit there waiting." Miss Marple studied the hook thoughtfully. "Which means the murderer needed detailed knowledge of Mr. Finch's routines. They needed to know that he filled his thermos every Sunday morning and that he always hung the empty thermos on that specific hook. The murderer also needed access to this shed," Inspector Slack added. "Who would have keys?" Constable Polk consulted his notes. "Only Finch himself had a key to his personal shed. However, the association secretary holds a master key that opens all individual sheds in case of emergency. That would be Dorothy Price." Miss Marple recalled Dorothy Price's accusations about embezzlement. A woman who believed Finch was stealing would certainly have motive for murder, and as secretary, she would have access to any shed. However, something about the vandalized Marrows continued to trouble Miss Marple. The damage had been deliberate and performative, designed to be noticed, but examining the cuts more carefully, the damage was precisely calculated to appear worse than it actually was. The Marrows had been cut, but not deeply enough to completely ruin them. This suggested someone who understood marrow cultivation quite well, someone who knew exactly how much damage would create dramatic visual impact without actually destroying the vegetable's competitive viability. Any experienced gardener would have that knowledge, and the association contained dozens of such individuals. As Miss Marple prepared to leave the shed, her eye caught something else. In the corner was a shelf containing gardening reference books. One volume stood slightly proud of the others, as if recently consulted and not quite properly replaced. "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "might I examine that book?" It was titled Poisonous Plants of the British Isles, and someone had placed a bookmark at the page discussing aconite. The bookmark itself was a pressed flower specimen that she recognized as digitalis, another highly poisonous plant. Chapter 4. The Buried Treasure Beneath the Soil. By early afternoon, Inspector Slack had established more formal headquarters in the association's communal meeting hall. Miss Marple found herself examining the association's financial records at Dorothy Price's insistence. "You see," Price said, spreading ledgers across the long table, "the discrepancies are quite clear once you know what to look for. Harold claimed we spent £1,200 on new fencing last spring, but I contacted the supplier he supposedly used. They have no record of any such order. Similarly, he reported £1,800 for soil amendments, but the actual invoices show less than half that amount." Miss Marple studied the ledgers with characteristic attention to detail. Harold Finch's bookkeeping was impeccably neat, but Price was correct. The numbers didn't match the supporting documentation. "You estimate approximately £15,000 missing over 5 years, Miss Marple observed. Have you noticed any pattern to when the embezzled funds were taken?" Price pulled out a timeline she'd compiled. "Yes, the amounts increased over time. In the first year, only about £2,000. By last year, nearly £4,000, and this year approximately £5,000 so far." "One might wonder what Mr. Finch was doing with such substantial sums," Miss Marple murmured. "His lifestyle didn't appear to reflect sudden wealth." Mrs. Henderson spoke up. "Harold was always going on about saving for his retirement. He planned to move to Cornwall, had his eye on a cottage near the coast." At that moment, Constable Polk appeared looking excited. "Inspector Slack requests Miss Marple's presence at Finch's plot. We've found something significant in the digging area." The group made their way back to plot number 12, where Inspector Slack and Dr. Haydock were examining something carefully excavated from the corner where fresh digging had been most extensive. As Miss Marple approached, she saw they'd uncovered a waterproof container. "Empty," Inspector Slack announced, but based on the impression in the soil and the way the container was positioned, something was stored here recently. Something that was removed within the past day or two. Dr. Haydock examined the container more closely. The soil around it shows clear signs of disturbance. Someone dug this up, removed whatever was inside, and attempted to refill the hole, but they didn't compact the soil properly, so the disturbance remained visible. Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the excavation, studying the soil with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades observing such things. "The roots of Mr. Finch's marrow plants have been severed here," she observed. "That would require substantial digging, yet Mr. Finch was known for his meticulous care of these champion vegetables. He would never have damaged their roots deliberately." "Unless he had no choice," Inspector Slack said slowly. "Unless he needed to access whatever was buried here, regardless of damage to his plants." "Or," Miss Marple suggested gently, "unless someone else dug here, someone who cared less about the Marrows than about what lay beneath them." Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed. "You think someone other than Finch dug up whatever was buried here?" "The soil compaction patterns suggest two different digging episodes," Miss Marple replied. "One older, where the soil had time to settle and compact naturally around the container, and one very recent, where the soil was disturbed and hastily refilled. I would estimate the recent digging occurred within the past 48 hours. Dr. Haydock nodded thoughtfully. "Which would place it Saturday night or early Sunday morning. Around the same time, the Marrows were vandalized." Miss Marple rose carefully, brushing soil from her skirt. "Inspector, might I suggest examining the area more thoroughly? If Mr. Finch buried one container here, he may have buried others elsewhere on his plot." The search that followed proved Miss Marple correct. Over the next hour, they discovered evidence of 2 additional burial sites within Finch's plot, both showing signs of recent disturbance similar to the first location. All 3 containers had been removed, leaving only the impressions in the soil to mark where they had been. 3 hiding places, Inspector Slack mused. Whatever Finch was concealing, he didn't trust keeping it all in one location. Dorothy Price, who had followed them back to the plot, spoke with barely contained anger. "He was hiding the embezzled money, that's what this is about. Harold was stealing from the association and burying the evidence in his garden." £15,000 would be rather bulky to bury, Dr. Haydock observed, even in large denominations. Notes. That's a substantial physical volume. Miss Marple had been thinking along similar lines. Unless Mr. Finch converted the stolen money into something more compact, gold coins perhaps, or jewellery. Chapter 5. The Soil That Tells Secrets. The discovery of the empty burial sites had transformed Inspector Slack's investigation from a straightforward poisoning case into something considerably more complex. If Harold Finch had been hiding substantial assets in his allotment plot, then his murder might be connected not merely to his tyrannical management style, but to theft and recovery of stolen goods. Miss Marple excused herself from the official investigation and made her way to Thomas Wright's plot, number 31, which lay on the opposite side of the allotment grounds from Finch's showcase vegetables. Wright was there, ostensibly checking on his tomato plants, though his distracted manner suggested his mind was elsewhere entirely. "Mr. Wright," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "I hope I'm not disturbing your gardening." Wright looked up with a startled expression that quickly smoothed into polite welcome. "Not at all, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I'm not accomplishing much today. Can't seem to focus properly." Miss Marple settled herself on the small bench that Wright maintained near his tool shed, a thoughtful addition that his late wife had insisted upon for resting during long gardening sessions. "Understandable, given the morning's events. You must have known Mr. Finch for many years." 23 years, Wright confirmed, "though I can't say we were friends. Harold didn't really have friends, just people he tolerated and people he opposed. I fell into the tolerated category most of the time, though he threatened to move me into the opposed category last year." "The compost regulation issue Mrs. Henderson mentioned," Miss Marple prompted gently. Wright's expression darkened. "It was nonsense, pure harassment. Harold claimed my compost heap was positioned incorrectly and posed contamination risks to neighbouring plots. Complete fabrication. I'd been using that same compost location for 15 years without issue. Harold just enjoyed wielding power." As they spoke, Miss Marple's observant eyes took in the details of Wright's plot. It was beautifully maintained, a testament to years of dedicated cultivation. His late wife's influence was still visible in the careful arrangement of perennial borders and the artistic placement of decorative elements among the functional vegetable beds. However, what caught Miss Marple's particular attention was a section near Wright's tool shed where the soil appeared recently disturbed. The disturbance was subtle, carefully concealed with surface mulch, but unmistakable to someone with Miss Marple's experience. Moreover, the disturbed area was approximately the right size to have temporarily concealed something substantial, something that might have been removed quite recently. "Your tomatoes are looking splendid," Miss Marple observed, deliberately changing the subject. "The variety with the deep red colour, are they San Marzano?" Wright looked pleased despite his obvious preoccupation. "Costaluto Fiorentino, actually. Margaret's favourite variety. She always said they had the best flavour for fresh eating. I plant them every year in her memory." Miss Marple smiled warmly. How lovely. Maintaining the garden as she designed it must provide great comfort. "It does," Wright said quietly. "This plot is my connection to Margaret, to the life we built together here in St. Mary Mead. When Harold threatened to take it away last year, I realised I would do almost anything to protect it. This garden isn't just plants and soil to me, Miss Marple. It's sacred ground." The intensity of his words hung in the air between them. Miss Marple understood the depth of emotion that could attach to places and objects associated with lost loved ones, but she also understood how such emotion, when threatened, could drive people to desperate actions. Rising from the bench, Miss Marple made as if to depart, then paused as if something had just occurred to her. "Mr. Wright, I couldn't help but notice earlier that your gardening trousers had some unusual mud staining, that distinctive reddish clay colour. Most interesting, as the soil in your plot appears to be primarily sandy loam." Wright glanced down at his trousers, and Miss Marple saw the brief flash of alarm in his eyes before he composed himself. "Oh, that. Yes, I was helping old Mr. Patterson with his plot yesterday afternoon. He's been poorly, and his section has that heavy clay soil. Difficult to work, but I couldn't leave him to struggle alone." "How very kind of you," Miss Marple murmured. "Mr. Patterson's plot is number 18, I believe." "That's correct," Wright confirmed. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly and took her leave, but her mind was working rapidly. Mr. Patterson's plot was indeed number 18, but it was positioned on the western side of the allotment grounds, nowhere near Harold Finch's plot number 12 on the eastern side. Yet the clay-red soil on Wright's trousers was identical in composition to the distinctive soil in Finch's section. Moreover, Miss Marple had noticed something else during her brief visit to Wright's plot. His gardening boots, positioned neatly outside his tool shed, showed traces of the same clay-red soil. And more tellingly, the treads of those boots matched perfectly with footprint impressions she had observed earlier in the disturbed soil around Finch's burial sites. Returning to the communal meeting hall, Miss Marple found Inspector Slack conferring with Dr. Haydock over a series of photographs documenting the crime scene. "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "I wonder whether you might have Constable Polk take soil samples from various plots around the allotment grounds. I believe you'll find that different areas have quite distinct soil compositions, legacy of the land's historical uses before it became an allotment association." Inspector Slack looked sceptical but intrigued. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Simply that soil adhering to footwear or clothing might indicate where someone has been working recently," Miss Marple replied mildly. "The clay-red soil in Mr. Finch's plot, for instance, is quite distinctive. Anyone who had been digging there would carry traces of it for some time afterward." Dr. Haydock's eyes lit with understanding. "You're thinking of Wright. I noticed his trousers this morning, muddy at the knees. And you're right, that did look like clay staining rather than the sandy soil from his own plot." Chapter 6. The Accountant's Dangerous Discovery. While Inspector Slack dispatched Constable Polk to collect soil samples from around the allotment grounds, Miss Marple found herself once again in conversation with Dorothy Price. The association secretary had been compiling additional evidence of Harold Finch's financial misconduct, and her discoveries grew more damning with each hour of investigation. "Look at this," Price said, spreading a series of bank statements across the table. "These are Harold's personal accounts, which I obtained through, well, let's say through determination and knowledge of where he kept his filing. The deposits don't match his known income. Over the past 5 years, he made regular deposits totaling far more than his salary and pension combined. Miss Marple studied the statements with interest. The deposits were indeed substantial, ranging from £500 to £2,000, occurring every few months with suspicious regularity. And here, Price continued, producing another document, is a receipt I found in Harold's desk. A gold dealer in London. Harold purchased £15,000 worth of gold sovereigns over the course of 18 months, paying in cash each time. Mrs. Henderson, who had remained present throughout these revelations, looked genuinely shocked. £15,000 in gold coins. But why would Harold do such a thing? To hide the embezzled money, Price replied with certainty. Gold is compact, doesn't deteriorate, and can be easily converted back to cash when needed. Harold was planning for his retirement in Cornwall, building himself a nice nest egg with stolen association funds. Miss Marple considered this theory carefully. £15,000 in gold sovereigns would be quite heavy, several kilograms at least. Yet the burial sites we discovered could easily have held such weight. 3 containers, each holding approximately £5,000 worth of gold. Which someone removed Saturday night, Price said grimly. Someone who knew what Harold had buried there. The question is how they knew, Miss Marple observed. Mr. Finch presumably took great care to conceal his activities. Who would have been in a position to discover his secret? Price's expression grew uncomfortable. I confronted Harold at last month's association meeting about the missing money. I didn't have proof about the gold at that point, just the discrepancies in the accounts. But after Harold threatened me, I started investigating more thoroughly. I may have, perhaps, mentioned my suspicions to 1 or 2 other members. Which members? Miss Marple inquired gently. Thomas Wright, for one, Price admitted. He'd been keeping his own records after Harold threatened to expel him. Wright has a background in accounting, worked for an auditing firm before he retired. I thought he might be able to help me trace where the money had gone. This information cast Thomas Wright's involvement in an entirely new light. If Wright had known about the embezzlement and had investigative skills to trace the missing funds, he would have been perfectly positioned to discover Finch's buried gold. What was Mr. Wright's reaction when you shared your suspicions? Miss Marple asked. Price thought back carefully. He was angry, but controlled about it. Said he'd suspected Harold of financial irregularities, but hadn't been able to prove anything. He asked to see my documentation and spent several evenings going through everything. About 2 weeks ago, he told me he thought he'd figured out where the money had gone, but he needed time to confirm his theory before making accusations. And did he confirm his theory? Miss Marple prompted. I don't know, Price replied. We'd planned to meet this coming Monday to review his findings. He said he wanted to be absolutely certain before we took the evidence to the police. With Harold dead, I suppose that meeting is rather moot now. Inspector Slack chose that moment to return from his soil sampling expedition, accompanied by Constable Polk, who carried several labelled evidence bags containing soil from various plots. Miss Marple, the inspector said, you were quite right about the soil variations. Finch's plot has that distinctive clay composition you mentioned. We've also taken samples from Wright's plot, Patterson's plot, and several others for comparison. And Mr. Wright's gardening boots, Miss Marple inquired mildly. Were you able to obtain samples from those as well? Inspector Slack's expression suggested he'd already thought of this. We have. Wright was quite cooperative when I explained we were taking samples from everyone's footwear for elimination purposes. The laboratory will analyse everything and provide comparisons. Dr. Haydock joined their conference looking thoughtful. I've been considering the timeline of events. If someone dug up Finch's buried gold Saturday night, and the Marrows were vandalized during the same period, we need to determine whether these were connected activities or separate incidents. The vandalism might have been intended as a distraction, Miss Marple suggested. If someone was digging extensively in Finch's plot, they would need to ensure that any discovery of the disturbance would be attributed to vandalism rather than theft. Inspector Slack nodded slowly. So the vandal damages the Marrows prominently, creating an obvious explanation for why someone might have been on Finch's plot overnight. Anyone discovering the damaged vegetables would focus on that, rather than noticing the subtler signs of digging elsewhere. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. And if Mr. Finch discovered both the vandalism and the theft Sunday morning, he would naturally assume they were related acts of rivalry, rather than a calculated crime of a different nature entirely. "But why poison him?" Mrs. Henderson asked with genuine confusion. "If someone had already stolen the buried gold, why not simply leave with their ill-gotten gains? Why commit murder?" Miss Marple had been pondering this same question. Perhaps because Mr. Finch knew who had taken the gold, or perhaps because the thief believed Finch would be able to trace them and recover the stolen items, or possibly, she paused thoughtfully, because the murder served a dual purpose, both eliminating someone who posed a threat and punishing them for their own crimes. The implications of this theory settled over the group like a heavy blanket. If Thomas Wright had discovered Finch's embezzlement, confronted him, and stolen the buried gold, he might well have decided that murdering Finch was necessary to protect himself. Chapter 7. The Pressed Flower Bookmark's Message. As the investigation progressed into late afternoon, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to Harold Finch's garden shed and the curious book she'd discovered earlier. The volume on poisonous plants had been positioned deliberately, she felt certain, but whether as evidence planted by the murderer or as a genuine research tool remained unclear. Obtaining permission from Inspector Slack to examine the shed more thoroughly, Miss Marple conducted a meticulous search of Finch's reference library. There were perhaps 24 books in total, ranging from practical guides to vegetable cultivation to more scholarly texts on soil chemistry and pest management. The poisonous plants volume stood out not merely because of its marked page on aconite, but because of the pressed flower bookmark someone had placed there. The specimen was beautifully preserved, clearly the work of someone with botanical knowledge and appreciation for proper pressing techniques. Miss Marple removed the bookmark carefully and examined it in better light. The foxglove flower had been pressed at the perfect stage of bloom, its purple-pink petals still retaining much of their original colour despite being dried. The stem and leaves were intact, suggesting this was meant as a specimen for study rather than simple decoration. Turning the bookmark over, Miss Marple discovered something she'd missed during her initial examination. On the reverse side, in pencil so faint it was nearly invisible, someone had written a date. August 7th. That was precisely 1 week before Harold Finch's murder. "Inspector," Miss Marple called softly, "I believe this bookmark may be more significant than we initially supposed." Inspector Slack joined her in the shed, along with Dr. Haydock, who had been examining Finch's tea station again. Miss Marple showed them the dated bookmark and explained its potential significance. "Foxglove contains digitalis," Dr. Haydock observed, "another powerful poison, though with quite different effects than aconite. Both are plant-based toxins that someone with botanical knowledge might have access to." "The date suggests this bookmark was placed here a week before the murder," Miss Marple noted, "which implies premeditation. Someone was researching poison well in advance of actually using it." Inspector Slack examined the bookmark carefully. "The question is whether Finch placed this here himself, perhaps researching dangerous plants for some legitimate reason, or whether someone else put it here as part of their murder preparations." Miss Marple had been considering this question. Mr. Finch was known for his meticulous organisation. Every other book in this collection is properly shelved, with markers and notes filed systematically. This volume on poisonous plants was the only one left pulled out and open, as if someone had been consulting it recently and hastily concealed their research. Suggesting the murderer was in Finch's shed, researching poison, and left the book as they found it rather than returning it properly, de Haydock concluded. "But when?" Inspector Slack demanded. "When would someone have had unsupervised access to this shed to conduct such research?" Miss Marple thought carefully about the Allotment Association's routines and practices. The sheds are generally locked when gardeners aren't present, but during working hours, particularly on weekends when many members are tending their plots, people often leave sheds open for convenience. Someone walking past could easily slip inside for a few moments without being noticed. "Especially if they had a legitimate reason to be in this area of the allotments," Inspector Slack added, understanding dawning. "Someone whose plot was near Finch's, or who had regular business bringing them past this location." Miss Marple nodded. "Thomas Wright's plot is not particularly close to Mr. Finch's, but as someone who had been helping Miss Price investigate the financial irregularities, Mr. Wright might well have had occasion to observe Mr. Finch's routines and movements. He could have noted when the shed was left open and accessible." "Circumstantial," Inspector Slack muttered, though his tone suggested he found the theory compelling. "We need something more concrete than soil samples and proximity to circumstantial evidence." At that moment, Constable Polk appeared at the shed door looking excited. "Inspector, the laboratory just telephoned preliminary results on those soil samples. The clay composition on Wright's boots is an exact match for the soil in Finch's plot, specifically from the areas where the burial sites were located. The analyst says the match is conclusive. Wright was definitely at those specific locations recently." Inspector Slack's expression hardened with satisfaction. "Right then, I think it's time we had another conversation with Mr. Thomas Wright. More pointed questions this time." They found Wright still at his plot, though he'd abandoned any pretense of actual gardening and was simply sitting on his bench staring at his late wife's carefully designed perennial borders. He looked up as they approached, and Miss Marple saw resignation in his expression, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation. "Mr. Wright," Inspector Slack began formally, "I need to ask you about the soil on your gardening boots. Laboratory analysis confirms it matches soil from Harold Finch's plot, specifically from the locations where burial sites were discovered. Can you explain how that soil came to be on your footwear?" Wright was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped together in his lap. Finally, he sighed deeply and looked up at them with tired eyes. "I suppose there's no point in denying it," he said quietly. "Yes, I was on Harold's plot Saturday night. I was searching for the gold I believed he'd buried there, gold purchased with embezzled association funds. And yes, I found it. 3 containers, £15,000 worth of gold sovereigns, stolen from the very people he was supposed to serve." Chapter 8. The Confession in the Garden. Inspector Slack had insisted on conducting the formal interview at the police station, but Thomas Wright had requested, and been granted, a few moments to collect himself before leaving his beloved plot. Miss Marple, with the inspector's tacit permission, remained present as Wright began to explain his actions of the past week. "Dorothy came to me about 5 weeks ago," Wright said, his voice steady despite obvious emotion. "She'd discovered significant discrepancies in the association's financial records and knew I had accounting experience. She asked if I could help trace where the missing money had gone. I agreed because I'd long suspected Harold was corrupt and I wanted proof." He paused, looking out across his carefully maintained vegetables. "It took me nearly 3 weeks of careful investigation, cross-referencing Harold's suspicious deposits with gold dealer records I managed to obtain through a friend in London. I discovered Harold had been systematically converting embezzled funds into gold sovereigns, purchasing them in cash to avoid creating paper trails." "When did you determine where he'd hidden the gold?" Miss Marple inquired gently. 2 weeks ago," Wright replied. "I'd been observing Harold's Sunday morning routine, noting how much time he spent at his plot and what areas he worked most frequently. The corner sections near his Marrows received excessive attention, far more than necessary for normal cultivation. I suspected burial, but I needed to confirm before taking action." Inspector Slack's expression remained stern. "So you broke into his plot Saturday night?" "I did," Wright confirmed without hesitation. "I waited until after midnight when I knew the grounds would be deserted. I brought tools and worked carefully to excavate the 3 sites I'd identified. It took nearly 4 hours, but I found all 3 containers. £15,000 in gold sovereigns, exactly as I'd calculated from Harold's purchasing records." "And the vandalized Marrows?" Dr. Haydock prompted. Wright's expression showed something that might have been shame. A calculated distraction. "I knew Harold would discover the disturbed soil Sunday morning. If the Marrows were also damaged, he would assume both were acts of rivalry vandalism rather than systematic theft. I damaged them precisely enough to appear malicious without completely destroying their competition viability. I wanted Harold to see what had been done, to focus his anger on Bernard Foster or another competitor, rather than investigating the soil disturbance too carefully." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But you didn't simply steal the gold, Mr. Wright. You also poisoned Mr. Finch. The aconite on the thermos hook in his shed, that was your doing as well." Wright met her gaze directly. "Yes, I placed the poison there Friday evening. I'd been researching plant-based toxins for weeks, supposedly for an article I claimed to be writing about dangerous garden plants. Aconite was ideal because it acts quickly, and the symptoms might be mistaken for cardiac arrest in a man of Harold's age and temperament." Why murder? Inspector Slack demanded. If you'd recovered the stolen gold and had evidence of embezzlement, you could have gone to the police. Harold would have been arrested and prosecuted. Why take justice into your own hands? Wright's composure finally cracked slightly, his voice taking on harder edge. Because Harold threatened more than just the association finances, Inspector. He was planning to sell the entire allotment grounds to a developer. I found documents in his files showing negotiations for £200,000. He intended to pocket the money, claim the association couldn't afford maintenance, and eliminate our gardens entirely. Every plot, every garden lovingly cultivated for years, destroyed to line his pockets further. Mrs. Henderson, who had followed them to Wright's plot, gasped audibly. He was going to sell the allotments, our gardens, but he had no authority to do that. He'd been manoeuvring for years to consolidate control, Wright explained bitterly, changed the association bylaws gradually, positioned himself as sole trustee of the property deed, eliminated oversight mechanisms. By the time anyone realized what he'd done, it would have been too late. The sale was scheduled to complete in 3 months. Miss Marple felt a chill of understanding. So you weren't simply recovering stolen money or punishing a thief. You were preventing the destruction of something far more valuable than gold. These gardens represent decades of work, memories, connections to loved ones who've passed. You were protecting all of that. Wright nodded, his eyes glistening. This plot is my last connection to Margaret. I couldn't let Harold destroy it for money. Chapter 9. The Incomplete Recovery and Remaining Questions. The revelation about Harold Finch's plan to sell the allotment grounds had transformed the investigation's emotional landscape. While Wright's confession to murder was damning, his motive carried a weight that even Inspector Slack seemed reluctant to dismiss entirely. However, as Miss Marple listened to Wright's account, certain inconsistencies troubled her methodical mind. "Mr. Wright," she said carefully, "you mentioned recovering £15,000 worth of gold from the 3 burial sites. Yet Miss Price calculated that Mr. Finch embezzled approximately £15,000 over 5 years. Don't you find that remarkably convenient?" Wright looked puzzled. "I assumed the amounts matched because Harold converted all the stolen money directly into gold. What are you suggesting?" Miss Marple turned to Dorothy Price. "Miss Price, when you examined the financial records, were you able to account for all discrepancies, or might there have been additional embezzlement you hadn't yet discovered?" Price frowned, clearly thinking back through her investigation. "I focused primarily on the past 3 years where documentation was most complete. The earlier years had some gaps in records that Harold claimed were due to a filing system change. I suppose there could have been additional missing funds I hadn't calculated yet." "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "I believe Mr. Finch embezzled far more than £15,000. The pattern Miss Price described showed increasing amounts over time. If we extrapolate that pattern backward and account for the gaps in early records, the total theft might be substantially larger." Dr. Haydock caught her meaning immediately. "You're suggesting there's more gold still buried somewhere on the allotment grounds?" "I think it highly likely," Miss Marple confirmed. "Mr. Finch was systematic and cautious. He wouldn't have kept all his stolen assets in one location or even 3 locations on his own plot. He would have diversified his hiding places, probably using areas of the allotment grounds where he had legitimate reasons to be present." Wright's expression shifted from resignation to something approaching alarm. "But I found all 3 containers on Harold's plot. I was certain that was everything." "You found what Mr. Finch wanted readily discoverable if someone came looking," Miss Marple suggested. "The burial sites on his own plot were relatively shallow, relatively obvious to anyone who knew what to search for. But Mr. Finch was conducting those suspicious plot inspections for years, claiming to check cultivation standards. What if he was actually identifying locations where he could bury additional containers without suspicion?" Inspector Slack's eyes narrowed with understanding. Plots that had been vacated or reassigned. Areas where the soil had recently been disturbed for legitimate reasons. He could dig during his inspections, bury containers, and no one would question his presence. Miss Marple nodded. "Mrs. Henderson, you mentioned that Mr. Finch expelled you from plot number 8 and took it over for his own use. When did that occur?" 3 years ago, Mrs. Henderson replied. "Harold claimed my weeds were spreading, forced me to relocate to plot 43. And Plot 8 now belongs to Mr. Finch's expanded vegetable operation, Miss Marple observed. I suspect if we were to examine that section carefully, we might find additional burial sites. Similarly, any plots that were reassigned over the past 5 years under Mr. Finch's authority might warrant investigation. Inspector Slack immediately dispatched Constable Polk to begin systematic examination of the plots Miss Marple had identified. Within an hour they had discovered 2 additional burial sites, one on the former Plot 8 and another on a section that had been temporarily vacant 2 years ago during a membership transition. Both sites were empty, the containers removed recently, but not as recently as the 3 sites on Finch's primary plot. The soil disturbance patterns suggested these had been excavated perhaps a week earlier, possibly longer. Someone else knew about these locations, Inspector Slack said grimly. Someone got here before Wright did. Wright looked genuinely shocked. I had no idea these sites existed. I only found the 3 on Harold's plot. You're saying someone else discovered Harold's scheme and removed gold before I did? Miss Marple studied the newly discovered sites with her characteristic attention to detail. The excavation technique was different from Wright's careful archaeological approach. These holes had been dug hastily, efficiently, by someone who knew exactly where to dig and wanted to complete the work quickly. The footprints here are different, she observed, examining the impressions in the clay soil. Smaller than Mr. Wright's boots, and with a distinctly different tread pattern. Inspector, I believe we have a second thief. Someone who discovered Mr. Finch's buried gold before Mr. Wright did and removed a substantial portion of it. Dr. Haydock examined the footprints with his magnifying glass. These are quite clear. We should be able to match them to someone's footwear fairly easily. As they searched the surrounding area for additional evidence, Miss Marple's attention was caught by something partially concealed beneath a bush near one of the excavation sites. She retrieved it carefully and found herself holding a small gardening trowel, expensive and well-maintained, with initials carved into the wooden handle, SM. Sarah Mitchell, Mrs. Henderson breathed, recognizing the tool. That's Sarah's trowel. I'd recognize it anywhere. Her husband George carved their initials into it as an anniversary gift years ago. Inspector Slack's expression hardened. It appears we need to have another conversation, this time with Miss Sarah Mitchell. Chapter 10. The Truth Among the Herbs and Heartbreak. Finding Sarah Mitchell proved more challenging than expected. She had not returned to her cottage after leaving the allotment grounds that morning, and inquiries around the village produced no information about her current whereabouts. It was Miss Marple who finally suggested checking St. Mary Mead's small cemetery, where Sarah's husband George had been buried 15 months earlier. They found her there, sitting beside George's gravestone with the morning's newspaper spread across her lap. The headline announced Harold Finch's murder and Thomas Wright's confession. Sarah looked up as they approached, her expression carrying resignation rather than surprise. I wondered when you would come, she said quietly. I heard about Thomas confessing. He shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't be taking blame for my actions. Inspector Slack exchanged glances with Miss Marple before speaking. Miss Mitchell, I need to ask you about your involvement in the events surrounding Harold Finch's death. Sarah nodded slowly. I killed him, Inspector, not Thomas. I placed the aconite on the thermos hook in Harold's shed. I planned it for weeks after I discovered what he'd done, what he was planning to do. Miss Marple settled carefully on the bench near the gravestone. You discovered Mr. Finch's embezzlement scheme before Mr. Wright did, didn't you? And you found where he'd buried the stolen gold. 6 weeks ago, Sarah confirmed. I'd been struggling financially since George died. Medical bills, funeral expenses, everything. I couldn't afford my association fees anymore, was terrified Harold would expel me like he'd done to others. I went to his shed one evening to beg for a payment extension. He wasn't there, but I saw financial documents spread across his workbench. I recognized the gold dealer invoices because George and I had considered buying gold sovereigns as an investment years ago. She paused, tears tracking down her cheeks. I started investigating, watching Harold's movements, trying to understand where he'd hidden the gold. I needed that money desperately, Inspector. Not just for myself, but for the association. I discovered Harold's plan to sell the allotment grounds. I realized if I could recover the stolen money, I could save our gardens. So, you excavated the burial sites you'd identified, Miss Marple said gently. The 2 on former plots that Harold had taken control over during reassignments. Sarah nodded. I worked at night over several weeks. I found approximately £30,000 worth of gold in those 2 locations. I was planning to return it to the Sherdness. association anonymously to give us resources to fight Harold's development scheme. But then Dorothy Price started her investigation, and Thomas got involved, and I realized others were closing in on the truth. Inspector Slack's expression remained stern, but showed hints of sympathy. Why poison Finch? Why not simply expose his crimes with the evidence you'd gathered? Sarah's voice hardened. Because Harold would have destroyed us all trying to protect himself. He had lawyers, connections, money. He would have claimed the gold was his personal property, accused me of theft, turned everything around. And even if he'd been prosecuted eventually, the damage would be done. The allotment sale would proceed, our gardens would be destroyed, everything George and I built together would be gone. She looked at George's gravestone with infinite sadness. This plot, Inspector, plot 23, where George and I spent 15 years building something beautiful together, it was everything to me after he died. When Harold refused my transfer request, told me grief wasn't sufficient reason to accommodate my needs, I realized he was incapable of understanding what these gardens mean to people. They're not just vegetables and flowers. They're memories, connections, love made tangible. Miss Marple understood completely. So, you decided Harold had to be stopped permanently. I researched aconite, learned it could be mistaken for cardiac arrest, planned how to apply it to the thermos hook, where it would transfer to Harold's morning tea. I knew his routine perfectly from months of observation. Friday evening, I used the master key I'd borrowed from Dorothy's office to enter his shed and contaminate the hook. Sunday morning, Harold would drink his poisoned tea and die, and his crimes would die with him. Wright had been listening intently throughout this confession. But Sarah, I confessed to the murder. I poisoned Harold. Sarah shook her head firmly. No, Thomas. You recovered the gold from Harold's plot and vandalized his Marrows, but you didn't kill him. I did that. I couldn't let you take responsibility for protecting something we all loved. Inspector Slack looked between them with growing confusion. Are you both claiming to have poisoned Harold Finch? Dr. Haydock, who had been examining Sarah's footwear discreetly during the conversation, spoke up. Inspector, Miss Mitchell's garden shoes match the footprints at the excavation sites where the earlier gold theft occurred, but they don't match any prints found near Finch's shed on the night he died. Moreover, the timing doesn't work. If Mitchell poisoned the hook Friday evening, as she claims, but Wright also claims to have done the same thing, one of them is mistaken about when the poison was applied. Miss Marple had been thinking carefully about the timeline and the physical evidence. I believe, she said slowly, that we're dealing with two separate murder attempts. Miss Mitchell contaminated the thermos hook Friday evening, intending for Mr. Finch to be poisoned Sunday morning, but Mr. Wright, unaware of Miss Mitchell's actions, also contaminated the hook Saturday evening when he prepared his own murder plan. The hook received 2 applications of poison, one from each would-be murderer. The implications of this theory settled over the group like a heavy blanket. 2 people, independently and unknowingly, had planned the same murder using the same method at nearly the same time. Inspector Slack looked incredulous. So both of you tried to kill Finch, but neither of you knew the other was doing the same thing. Wright and Mitchell stared at each other with dawning understanding and shared horror. They had both been driven to the same desperate action by the same tyrant's systematic destruction of something precious. As Inspector Slack prepared to take both suspects into custody, Miss Marple remained on the cemetery bench, looking at George Mitchell's gravestone and thinking about the profound love that had driven his widow to both theft and murder. The allotment grounds were saved, the embezzled gold would be recovered and returned, and Harold Finch's plan to destroy the gardens had died with him. But the cost of that salvation was terrible. 2 people now faced prosecution for murder, both motivated not by greed or hatred alone, but by desperate need to protect a community space that represented memory, connection, and the best of human cultivation. Miss Marple understood that Inspector Slack and the courts would need to grapple with questions that had no easy answers about justice, about vigilantism, about whether protecting beloved spaces could ever justify taking human life. As the August sun began its descent toward evening, casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead's peaceful cemetery, Miss Marple reflected that some gardens demanded terrible prices for their preservation, and some secrets, once buried beneath champion marrows and carefully tended herbs, could never be fully harvested without destroying everything they were meant to protect. The allotment grounds would continue, but they would forever carry the memory of what their salvation had cost. And Miss Marple, walking slowly home through the gathering dusk, carried with her the sad knowledge that even the most beautiful gardens could conceal the darkest of human actions, and that love itself, when threatened, could drive gentle souls to commit the most desperate of crimes.